Preface of Mental Fascination. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Fiore. Mental Fascination by William Walker Atkinson. Preface. This book is Sidelight Manual No. 1, accompanying my main work entitled The Secret of Mental Magic, and being in the nature of a sequel, supplement, or sidelight thereto. The Sidelight Manuals, of which this is the first, are designed to bring out the details and special features of several of the lessons of which The Secret of Mental Magic is composed, and to give something in the nature of special instruction regarding the actual operation or workings of the principles referred to in the lessons of my main work. The present manual bears the above-mentioned relation to that lesson in my main work entitled Personal Influence. In order to obviate the repetition of the information contained in my main work, I have been obliged to constantly refer to the latter. This would be inexcusable were the present book offered as a separate and independent work, for it might be justly considered as an effort to force my main work upon the attention of the reader, for the purpose of increasing its sale. But inasmuch as the present book is advertised as a sidelight, and its relation to my main work is plainly stated in every notice, and particularly as its sale will be almost exclusively among those who have already purchased and studied my main work, I think I may reasonably ask to be absolved from such suspicion. I think that I have condensed much valuable information within the pages of this book, and I trust that my readers will like the work as well as I do. But be that as it may, I defy anyone to read it without gaining a strong practical realization of the powerful part, for good or ill, that mental fascination is playing in this 20th century world of ours. And I feel that the majority will agree with me that it is time that this potent influence should be studied, understood, mastered, and its sting extracted by such universal knowledge of its principles as will serve to destroy its improper employment. To those who may consider this rather dangerous knowledge to be spread broadcast, I will say that ignorance is no protection. I believe that in all cases the best way to dispel darkness, and all that goes with it, is to turn on the light. And this, then, is the spirit in which this book has been written. May you so receive it. William Walker Atkinson, Chicago, Illinois, USA, May 13, 1907. End of preface. Recording by Andrea Fiore. Chapter 1 of Mental Fascination by William Walker Atkinson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Andrea Fiore. Chapter 1. What is Mental Fascination? Fascination means the act of fascinating, or state of being fascinated. The word fascinate springs from the Latin word fascinare, meaning to enchant, bewitch, charm by eyes or tongue, captivate, attract, etc. The definition of the English word fascinate is as follows: to act upon by some powerful or irresistible influence, to influence by an irresistible charm, to allure or excite, irresistibly or powerfully, to charm, captivate, or attract, powerfully, to influence the imagination, reason, or will of another in an uncontrollable manner, to enchant, captivate, or allure, powerfully or irresistibly. The above definition is condensed from a number of the best dictionaries, and gives the cream of the idea embodied in the word. My definition. In this manual I shall use the term mental fascination in the sense of the action of a mental force that powerfully influences the imagination, desire, or will of another. This is my own broad definition, which includes all the varied phenomena of personal magnetism, psychological influence, hypnotism, mesmerism, charming, etc., etc., all of which I hold to be but varying phases of phenomena of one force. These things are all a bit of the same piece, in spite of the claims to the contrary on the part of those who did not like the relationship. The nature of the force. What is the nature of the force which produces that which we call mental fascination, which latter I have defined as the action of a mental force that powerfully influences the imagination, desire, or will of another? Mental fascination is the manifestation. What is the nature of the mental force that powerfully influences? As you will see in some of the following chapters, there have been many theories advanced to account for this force, the theories varying from magnetic fluids to mere simple suggestions on the part of the influencing person. Nearly every writer on the subject has had his own pet theory, but although these theories varied and differed greatly, the effects produced were about the same, which naturally leads us to look for some common basic principle operating under all forms, regardless of the many theories advanced by those producing the effects. It is the old story here, as elsewhere. A man finds that he is able to produce certain phenomena by certain methods. He works along practical lines for a time, endeavoring to perfect his methods and increase the variety and effectiveness of the phenomena. When he has advanced along these lines, he begins to look around him for a theory to fit the facts of the case, and here is where he usually makes his mistake. He evolves some fantastic theory, which seems to him to account for the effects produced, and then he endeavors to fit the facts into the theory. If the facts will not so fit in, well, so much worse for the facts, and he either discards the non-conforming facts, or else ignores or denies them. This has been the course of theorists since the beginning. After a while, some man of a more scientific mind examines the recorded facts, and discovers the true underlying principle, and reconciles the differing theories of the original theorists by a new synthesis, which combines the true principles in all the other theories, discarding the pet hobbies or prejudices of the previous authorities. And so it is the case of mental fascination, as we shall see. The underlying theory. I shall not have much to say about theory in this book. I have explained the theory and principle underlying mental fascination in my larger book entitled The Secret of Mental Magic, of which this little manual is a sidelight. In that book I have explained the underlying force beneath all forms of mental magic, and mental fascination is one of those forms. It is the universal mentative energy, of which, and in which, each individual mind is a center of activity. I have also explained that the mentative energy of each individual mind is and may be transmitted from one person to another by means of mentative currents or waves, and that these mentative currents and waves tend to induce in the minds of other persons the emotions or feelings existing in the mental states of the person sending out the waves or currents. The mental poles. I have also explained that there are two mental poles, known as the motive and emotive poles, respectively, which manifest will power and desire force, respectively. Desire force acts in the direction of drawing, pulling, attracting, luring, coaxing, charming, etc., while will power acts in the direction of compelling, forcing, driving, impelling, commanding, demanding, etc. Desire always draws its object toward itself, while will always overpowers and compels its object, generally in the sense of driving it into action. In mental fascination both desire force and will power are employed, generally in combination. Desire force has been called the feminine phase of mentative energy, and will power the masculine, and in this as in everything else, the combination of those two qualities produces the most marked results. The student will be able to distinguish between the action of these two phases of the force as he reads the pages of this book in which instances of mental fascination are given. That is all that I shall have to say about theory in this book, except where the various points are brought out in illustrating the examples given. I must refer my students to my Secret of Mental Magic for details of theory and principle. The present book deals with the how rather than the why. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Andrea Fiore.
Chapter 2 of Mental Fascination. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mental Fascination by William Walker Atkinson. Chapter 2. Mental Fascination Among the Animals. Even before the human race was evolved, mental fascination was known instinctively to the lower forms of life. It is said that the cells in the blood of living things become aware of the presence of each other, at distances which must preclude any theory of ordinary sense awareness. Not only do they recognize or sense the presence of each other, but they seem to be attracted toward each other by some force, or fascination, which must operate along the lines of desire and will. Eminent scientists inform us that even the atoms manifest an attraction for each other, varying in degree according to the nature of the respective atoms. And the same authorities tell us that this attracting operates along the lines of a desire for each other, and a will, which causes them to fly to each other. Is it not reasonable to suppose that in this instinctive manifestation of attraction, and the response to attraction among the atoms, there is to be found the elemental principle of mental fascination? And are not the phenomena of electrical attraction and magnetic attraction related to the human phenomena by a long series of links in a grand chain? The two phases. But leaving the above questions without further consideration, we may find an abundance of proof among the higher forms of the lower animals. Among the animals we find many instances of the power of charming or fascinating, both of which I hold to be but varying forms of manifestation of mental fascination, as I use the term, i.e., the action of a mental force that powerfully influences the imagination, desire, or will of another. This mental fascination among the animals manifests along two lines, viz. 1. Along the lines of desire operating in the direction of sex manifestation, such as the winning of mates, etc., and 2. Along the lines of will operation in the direction of overcoming the prey of the animal, such as the charming of birds by serpents, or of the smaller animals by tigers, etc. These cases are capable of liberal illustration and proof, and natural history affords us full authority for accepting the same. Instances of animal fascination. I recently read an account of a naturalist who related that one day in a tropical country he noticed a winged insect circling around and around a scorpion. After a bit, the insect made a series of desperate plunges at the scorpion, as if in a frantic desire to terminate the charm, the scorpion soon striking down the insect and afterwards devouring it. It is related by travelers that when one comes suddenly in the presence of a lion, tiger, or leopard, his legs seem paralyzed, and the eyes of the beast seem to exert a peculiar fascination and power over him. I have seen a mouse manifest the same emotion in the presence of a cat, and the same is true of a rat in the presence of a ferret or similar enemy. On the other hand, every observer has noticed the wonderful charming power that animals exert over others of their kind, of the opposite sex. If you have ever witnessed the courting of a bird during the mating season, you will have a keen sense of the reality of the power employed. One of the birds, and it may be either the male or female, will be seen to actually fascinate or charm the one of the opposite sex, the latter lying still with quivering wings and a helpless expression in its eyes. When compared with the attitude of the same bird when charmed by a serpent, the resemblance will be striking. Scientific testimony. I have before me a book written in 1847, which relates quite a number of instances in the operation of mental fascination among the lower animals. I will give you a few of them, condensed and abbreviated. Professor Silliman is quoted as stating that one day, while crossing the Hudson River at Catskill, he passed along a narrow road with the river on one side and a steep bank covered by bushes on the other side. His attention was attracted by the sight of a number of birds of a variety of species who were flying forward and backwards across the road, turning and wheeling in strange gyrations and with noisy chirpings, seemingly centering over a particular point of the road. Upon examination the professor found an enormous black snake, partly coiled and partly erect, showing an appearance of great animation, with his eyes flashing like a brilliant diamond, and his tongue darting in and out. The snake was the center of the motion of the birds. The professor adds that although the snake disappeared in the bushes, frightened at the approach of the men, still the birds seemed too dazed to escape, and perched on the nearby bushes, evidently awaiting the reappearance of their charmer. The Charming by Snakes. The same book relates an incident of a man in Pennsylvania who saw a large black snake charming a bird. The bird described gradually decreasing circles around the snake, at the same time uttering piteous cries. It seemed almost ready to drop into the jaws of the snake, when the man drove off the latter, when the bird arose with a song of joy. Another case is related of a ground squirrel, which was observed running to and fro between a creek and a large tree a few yards distant. The squirrel's fur was badly ruffled, and he exhibited fright and distress. Investigation disclosed the head and neck of a rattlesnake protruding from the hole of the tree and pointing directly at the squirrel. The poor squirrel at last gave up the fight, and yielding to the fascination, laid himself down with his head very close to the snake's mouth. The snake then proceeded to swallow the squirrel, when his meal was interrupted with a cut of a carriage whip in the hands of the observer, and the squirrel, released from the spell, ran briskly away. Interesting instances. Dr. Good is quoted as having made quite a study of the curious fascinating power that rattlesnakes manifest over small animals, such as birds, squirrels, and young hares, etc. He relates that these animals seem incapable of drawing their eyes away from those of the snake, and, although seemingly struggling to get away, they still gradually approach the snake, as though urged toward him, or attracted by a power superior to their natural instincts. He goes on to state that the animals creep nearer and nearer, until at last it is drawn into the serpent's mouth, which has been open all the while to receive them. Dr. Barrow is quoted as relating many instances of this kind known to peasants in all parts of the world. Valiant, the African traveler, tells of an instance in which he witnessed a shrike at the very act of being fascinated by a large snake at a distance, the fiery eyes and open mouth of which was gradually approaching the bird, the latter manifesting convulsive trembling and uttering piercing shrieks of distress. The traveler shot the snake, but upon picking up the bird he found it dead, killed either by fear, or the power of the serpent, or perhaps by the violent breaking of the spell. He measured the distance between the snake and the bird, and found it to be 3 1/2 feet. Strange stories. A case is related in one of the early reports of the Philosophical Society, in which a mouse was put in a cage with a viper by way of an experiment. The mouse at first seemed greatly agitated, which state was followed by a condition of fascination, the mouse drawing nearer and nearer to the viper, which remained motionless, with distended jaws and glistening eyes. The mouse finally actually entered the jaws of the viper, and was devoured. Bruce, the African traveler, relates that the natives of an interior tribe seem to be protected by nature against the bite of scorpions and vipers. They are said to handle these creatures fearlessly, the latter seeming to be robbed of their power of resistance. He states that the creatures seem to sicken the moment they are touched by the natives, and are sometimes so exhausted by the invisible fascinating power that they perish shortly. He says, "I have constantly observed that however lively the viper was before, upon being seized by any of these barbarians, he seemed as if taken with sickness and feebleness, and frequently would shut his eyes, and would never turn his mouth toward the arm that held him." Snake Charmer. Personally, I have seen a somewhat similar case. When I was a boy in Maryland, I knew of a farm hand who was called a snake charmer. How he did it I could never find out, but he would exert some kind of influence over all kinds of snakes, poisonous ones included, and would cause them to remain fascinated until with a quick movement he would grab them by the neck with his bare hands. This man generally carried a few pet snakes around with him for company. They seemed perfectly contented, and would poke their heads up out of his pocket in order to look at someone else with whom he might be talking. The negroes on the farm had a mortal terror of this man, and would walk a couple of miles rather than pass by his house. Fascinating fierce animals. The power of charming animals, dogs, and wild beasts is undoubtedly possessed by some men in varying degrees, and nearly everyone has known of men who could charm the wildest horses as if by magic. I have read of some burglars who seemed able to quiet the most ferocious watchdogs. The Swedish writer Lindekrantz tells of certain natives of Lapland who are possessed of some process of charming dogs to such an extent that they have been known to cow the most savage greyhound, causing him to fly from them with all the signs of abject fear. Many of my readers have seen or heard of the horse whisperers found in various parts of the country, who will shut themselves in a stable with a fierce horse, and by whispering to him will manage to tame him completely and make him passive to their will. Charmed by a snake. There are cases recorded in which men, who have been charmed by a snake, have afterwards given in their experience. One of these cases relates that a man was walking in his garden when he suddenly came into the presence of a snake, whose eyes gleamed in a peculiar manner. He found himself fascinated as if by a spell, and unable to withdraw his eyes from those of the creature. The snake, he stated afterward, seemed to begin to increase immensely in size, and assumed in rapid succession a mixture of brilliant colours. He grew dizzy, and would have fallen in the direction of the snake, had not his wife approached, throwing her arms about him and breaking the spell. Another similar case is related in which a man found his companion standing still on the road, with his eyes fixed intently upon those of a large rattlesnake, which was regarding him fixedly with gleaming eyes, scintillating in its raised head. The man was leaning toward the snake, and would have fallen toward it in a few moments. He was crying feebly but piteously, "He will bite me! He will kill me!" "Sure he will," replied his friend. "Why don't you run away? Why are you staying here?" But the man seemed perfectly dazed and distracted, and could not answer. The companion finally picked up a stick and struck at the snake, which glided away savagely. The fascinated man was sick for several hours afterward. A personal experience. When I was a boy I had somewhat similar experience, although not nearly so serious. Walking one day among a grove of trees belonging to my grandfather, I found myself standing, staring intently at a snake about 2 feet long, whose eyes glistened like large diamonds. In a moment I ceased to see anything but those awful eyes, which glistened and displayed all the prismatic colours to my frightened glance. It lasted but a moment, however, for the snake glided away, seemingly as anxious to get away from me as I was to part company with him. I cannot say whether the spell would have been broken by me if the snake had not moved away. Perhaps it might, or perhaps not. All that I remember now, after the passage of 35 years or more, is that I did not seem to feel fear after the first shock, my feeling and emotion seemingly being that of great wonder and amazement arising from what I saw in those eyes. An elemental force. But I have said enough regarding the manifestation of mental fascination among the lower animals. There are many interesting instances of this sort scattered through the pages of books on animal life, and nearly everyone who has lived in the woods or among wild life knows of many cases illustrating this fact, which have come under his own observation. I have mentioned these features of the subject merely for the purpose of showing you that we have to deal with a general natural principle which manifests throughout all life. This book has to deal with the manifestation of this force among men, but in closing this chapter, I would ask you to notice the resemblance between the manifestation of the force among the animals on the one hand, and among mankind on the other. The animals employ the force for 2 purposes, i.e., the captivating of mates and the capture of prey. And how do men and women use it? Among similar lines. Yes, I mean this, as startling as it may appear. For is not the use of fascination in the direction of attracting the opposite sex akin to the sex charming noticed among the birds and animals? And is not the use of fascination in the direction of influencing men and women along the lines of business or personal interest akin to the charming of prey by wild animals, serpents, etc.? You may see that evolution simply changes the form of use in this and other natural qualities and power, the force or power remaining the same under all of the changes. And does it not become important for us to understand, study, and guard ourselves against the employment of such an elemental force as this, which manifests along all planes of life, from lowest to highest? I emphatically answer yes. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Mental Fascination. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mental Fascination by William Walker Atkinson. Chapter 3. The Story of Mental Fascination. The story of mental fascination runs along with the history of the human race, for it has always been known to man in some form. Coming to primitive man along with other inheritances from still lower forms, it was used from the beginning. Its earliest forms were similar to its employment by the lower animals, such as has been mentioned in the preceding chapter. The strong-willed of the race influenced and dominated the weaker-willed ones. Without understanding its laws, the strong-willed barbarians discovered that they possessed a strange power of inducing mental states among their weaker-willed companions, and were thus enabled to work their will upon them. Many of the leaders of barbarian races owe their positions of prominence and leadership to this law of mental induction. The magic of the priests. But along with the rise of leaders, there was manifested a similar rise in power and influence of the priests. All races have had their priests, and have today. A priest is a man whose office is that of a mediator between men and their divinities, one who claims to represent the supernatural entities in their dealings with men, a religious or spiritual middleman, as it were. I use this expression in all seriousness, and with no desire to sneer at the priestly offices, which have played an important part in the history of the race. The priests, not being occupied with warfare or agriculture, and by reason of their support being contributed by the people, found plenty of time to think, a somewhat rare privilege in the early days, and even in these times for that matter. And so there gradually arose among all peoples a priestly caste that possessed the bulk of intelligence of the race. These priests soon began to recognize the importance of the mental forces, and they studied the underlying principles and laws of operation. This, of course, gave them an additional hold on the people, and a power over them. There seems to be no doubt but that even in the early days of the race, the priestly caste held a very wide knowledge of the laws and practice of mental fascination. Mystic powers. In the heart of Africa today, we find the voodoo men, or conjurers, or medicine men, well versed in the application of mental fascination. It was known among the early American Indians, although their degenerated descendants seem to have lost the knowledge, except in a few instances. The power of the priesthood among primitive races is based almost entirely upon some form of mental fascination. And as we see the race ascending in the scale, so do we see the priests displaying a broader and fuller knowledge of the subject in question. The history of the Oriental races show that a full knowledge of the operation of mental fascination has been possessed by them for thousands of years. In the pictured stories of the Egyptians, the traces of which appear in the ruined temples and other buildings, we see that they understood the art perfectly. In ancient Persia and Chaldea, the art arose to great heights. In fact, among all of the advanced ancient races of men, we find an important place given to the subject before us. The Ancient Mysteries. Among the ancient mysteries, the various ceremonies of the temples of the early races, we see many instances of the use of mental fascination. Back of the rites and ceremonies was always the same underlying principle of mentative induction. In the early use of the force, its employment was largely along the lines of healing, which phase of the subject does not concern us in this particular manual, although it belongs to the general subject of mental magic. But still we read in the pages of early history of many instances of mental fascination, pure and simple. That which was afterward called mesmerism, hypnotism, etc., was well known to the ancients, and, in fact, some of the recorded results coming down to us from the past have never been equaled by modern experimenters. Some of the feats of the modern Hindu magicians, or fakirs, which will be mentioned in detail as we proceed, have never been equaled by Western hypnotists. The Tale of the Magi. As I have stated in Lesson 4 of Mental Magic, the name magnet given to the lodestone or natural magnet was bestowed by the ancients because the observed properties of the lodestone resembled the mental power of the Magi, or esoteric priesthood of ancient Persia and Media. These priests were the Magi, or wise men of the East, who had developed wonderful mentative powers and who were known as wonder workers. The word magic comes from the same source. When the attracting power and quality of induction of the lodestone were noticed, it was remarked that the physical phenomena closely resembled the mental phenomena of the Magi, and therefore the lodestone was called the Magian stone, or the magic stone, from which sprung the terms magnet and magnetism. As the centuries rolled by, and the Western world had its attention called to the mysterious phenomena of mesmerism, etc., in the 18th century the public mind instinctively connected the phenomena with that of magnetism, and the terms animal magnetism, personal magnetism, etc., came into general use. And these terms persist to this day, and we hear the terms very magnetic, lacking magnetism, magnetic personality, etc., etc., as applied to people. And so history worked out an instance of the law of compensation. The magnet, which took its name because its properties resembled the phenomena resulting from the use of mentative influence by the Magi, repaid the debt after many centuries, and served to give a name to mental manifestations resembling those of the Magi in the dim past. The magnet gives back to the modern Magi the name it borrowed from the Magi of ancient Persia. This is an interesting bit of occult history, little known to the general public. Julius Caesar's fascination. Ancient history is full of instances of the operation of mental fascination among the people of the early days. It is related that Julius Caesar, while quite a young man, fell in with pirates near the Isle of Rhodes, who captured his ship and took him prisoner. They held him for several weeks while awaiting the ransom money being raised by his relatives. Plutarch writes that while the young Caesar was a captive of the pirates, he asserted his mastery over them to such an extent that he seemed a ruler rather than a prisoner. When he wished to rest or sleep, he forbade them to make any noise, and they obeyed him without question. He abused them and ordered them around like servants, and they did not seem to disobey him. He did not hesitate to threaten them with death when he regained his liberty, and they did not resent it, and he afterward made good his threat. The mystic power of Alcibiades. It is related of Alcibiades the Athenian that he once made a bet with some of the young Athenian nobles that he would publicly box the ears of Hipponicus, a venerable and greatly respected citizen. Not only did he bet that he would do this thing, but he also claimed that he would afterward compel the old man to give him his favorite daughter in marriage. The day following, when Hipponicus came out, Alcibiades walked up to him and gave him a resounding box on the ears. The old man seemed dazed and bewildered, and retired to his home. A great public outcry arose, and the young man seemed likely to fall a victim to the indignation of the citizens. But the next day Alcibiades went to the home of Hipponicus, and, after making a pretense of baring his back for punishment, he managed to induce in the old man a feeling of good humor and mirth, and obtained his pardon and goodwill, the latter increasing daily thereafter until finally he grew so devoted to the young man that he offered him the hand of his daughter in marriage, which was accepted. Any one who is acquainted with the recorded character of the Athenians will realize what a wonderful occurrence this was. It was a striking exhibition of mental fascination, without a question. The Napoleonic charm. All the great generals of history have possessed this quality. Caesar, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Frederick the Great, and the modern mystic warrior General Gordon all managed their men in a mysterious and wonderful manner, so that their troops worshipped them as almost gods, and went to their death willingly and joyfully. The single instance of Napoleon when he returned from Elba and confronted the Bourbon army drawn up to capture him should satisfy anyone of the possession of the greatest fascinating power by this wonderful man. You remember that the troops were drawn up confronting Napoleon, their muskets leveled at his breast in obedience to the command, "Aim." Napoleon, who was on foot, marched deliberately toward the troops with measured tread, gazing directly into their eyes. Then the officers shouted, "Fire!" A single shot would have killed Napoleon, and would have brought to the man who fired it a fortune from the Bourbon king. But not a man obeyed the order. So completely were they under the spell of Napoleon's fascination. Instead of firing, they threw down their guns and ran joyfully toward the Corsicans, shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" Their officers fled, and Napoleon, placing himself at the head of the troops, marched on to Paris. Other troops flocked to his standard at each point where he confronted them, although they had been sent out to capture or kill him. By the time the gate of Paris were reached, he was at the head of an immense army. The fascination manifested by this man was one of the marked instances of its possession of which we have any record, and it seems to endure to this day, almost a century after his death. The very mention of his name makes one's blood tingle. Modern examples. All great leaders of men, statesmen, orators, politicians, etc., have the power of mental fascination developed to a considerable degree. If you have ever come in contact with a man of this sort, you will always remember the impression he made upon you. Every man who knew James G. Blaine will remember his personal magnetism, of which so much was said during his lifetime. Anyone who heard the famous speech of William J. Bryan at the Chicago Convention, in which he made use of the famous expression, "Thou shalt not press upon the brow of labor the crown of thorns, thou shalt not crucify mankind upon the cross of gold," needs no further proof of the reality of mental fascination. Bryan was almost unknown to the majority of the delegates, and no thought of nominating him was entertained by them. But his magnetism was so great that it swept the convention like a mighty tidal wave, carrying all before it, and Bryan was carried around the hall on the shoulders of the delegates, who afterward made him their nominee for president. And although defeated twice, this man still possesses a wonderful fascination over hundreds of thousands of people in this country, who would rally around his standard at any time that he would sound the call. Henry Ward Beecher, at the great meeting in England, manifested the same power. The whole meeting was against him, and drowned his words by hoots, yells, and other noises, but Beecher looked them straight in the eye, and gradually cowed them into subjection, and then talked to them for 2 hours, and fairly carried the meeting by storm. He was but one man facing thousands of other men hostile to him, and determined to prevent him from speaking. But the single man won, by the power of his mental fascination, manifesting in the phase of will. It was not alone the words. In these cases, it was the will behind the words. The will is an actual living force, and is one of the 2 great phases or poles of mental fascination. Mesmer and his work. Coming down to the latter part of the 18th century, and omitting all reference to the phenomena of mental fascination recorded in the Middle Ages, we reach what may be called the beginning of the revival of the subject among the Western peoples. I allude to the work of Frederick Anton Mesmer, a man who understood far more than he taught, but who was regarded as a charlatan and a trickster by the ignorant learned men of his day. Those who are informed regarding the secret history of Mesmer know that he was an occultist of no mean attainments, who was compelled to cloak his real teachings with popular theories and sensational phenomena, in order to gain the attention of the world, and also to escape religious persecutions. Mesmer was born in 1734, and in 1775 began his work in Vienna by writing and teaching about a mysterious universal fluid, which was able to control the wills of people, and also cure them of diseases, and which could be controlled and operated by man. He taught that there was a universal fluid which permeated everything, and was capable of receiving and communicating all kinds of motions and impressions. This fluid, he thought, acted immediately upon the nerves, in which it is embodied and produced in the human body phenomena, similar to that of the lodestone or magnet. He called this fluid animal magnetism. He taught that this magnetism flowed rapidly from body to body, acted at a distance, was reflected by a mirror like light, etc., etc. Mesmer attracted to himself great attention and great abuse. On the one hand, he was sneered and scoffed at, and also driven out of the church for possessing the power of the devil and witchcraft. But on the other hand, he gathered around him a body of supporters and students. He was investigated by a royal commission and by scientific bodies with varying results. The coming of the French Revolution interfered with a general interest in the subject for a number of years. Mesmer's followers adhered to his general lines of theory and practice, with unimportant additions or changes. The Abbé Faria. In 1814, the Abbé Faria attracted much interest in Paris. His theories were different from those of Mesmer, inasmuch as he claimed that the sleep produced by Mesmer and his followers was not the result of any outside force, but was caused by the patient himself. For a number of years a spirited contest was waged between the two schools of mesmerists, and much bad feeling was developed. Braid and hypnotism. Then came James Braid, the Manchester surgeon, who proceeded to tear down the accepted theories, substituting one of his own. Braid may be called the father of hypnotism, the term being first employed in connection with his work. His theory was that there was no such thing as animal magnetism, but the phenomena obtained by Mesmer and his followers were caused by a physiological condition brought about by physical means, such as fixing the eyes, rigidity of the muscles, etc. Braid made some very important contributions to the knowledge on the subject, although of course all that he wrote or taught was colored by his own particular theories. Braid regarded the hypnotic sleep produced by his methods as the necessary condition and cause of the phenomena of animal magnetism. Braid's writings brought the subject before the attention of physicians who had up to his time avoided it as unprofessional, etc., and a series of investigations by medical men in France and Germany were begun, and have continued up to this time. The result of such investigation has been the placing of the subject upon a scientific basis. Lebu and suggestion. Dr. Lebu, of the school of Nancy, France, first brought into prominence the theory of suggestion, which has since found so many followers. Dr. Burnham, a pupil of Lebu in his work, Suggestive Therapeutics, carried his teacher's theories on still further. The theory of suggestion, as taught by Lebu and Burnham, was that the cause of the phenomena of mesmerism and animal magnetism, etc., lay in the verbal suggestion or verbal command of the hypnotist to the subject, given and received while the subject was in a deep hypnotic sleep. This hypnotic sleep was considered to be an essential and fundamental prerequisite of the phenomena. It was all sleep, with the teachers, students, and investigators at that day, and the majority of them are still under the spell of the old teachings. Burnham's mistake. As an instance of how near a man may come to a thing and still miss it, I may mention that Burnham has recorded that in rare cases, where the conditions were exceptionally favorable, he could obtain results even when the subject was not asleep. But he missed his opportunity of following up this promising lead, and to the end he proceeded upon the belief and theory that the hypnotic sleep was a necessary precedent to the phenomena obtained. He endeavored to produce the condition of deep sleep, or profound hypnosis, believing that the same was a necessary condition for suggestibility. The very word hypnosis arises from the Greek word meaning to lull to sleep. So you can see how deeply this idea of sleep was and is among hypnotists. Remember this always, please. Hypnosis means a condition of sleep, so never use the word in any other way. Mental fascination is not hypnosis, although hypnosis is a form of application of mental fascination. The New School. During the past 10 years or so there has arisen a new school of investigators of the phenomena of mesmerism, etc. This new school proceeds upon the theory that the hypnotic sleep is merely an incident, and that all the phenomena obtained by the earlier authorities is possible without the production of a sleep condition. In other words, sleep is not a necessary condition of suggestibility. This brings a new school of the suggestionists very near to the occult idea of mental fascination, although there are some radical differences, as I shall show in a moment. In 1884, Dr. Bremand announced that he had made the discovery that there is a fourth hypnotic state, which he called fascination, which left the subject in full consciousness of his surroundings and remembrance of what had taken place. If Bremand had only had the courage to omit the fetish word hypnotic from his statement, he would have founded a new school, but he didn't. The German Frohman wrote a large book on the subject of fascination, which he defined as hypnotism without the putting to sleep. The truth about suggestion. Some of the best work along the without sleep hypnotism has been done by American experimenters and investigators, principally physicians, nearly all of whom believe that suggestion is the explanation of the whole thing, and that there is no such thing as a passage of mental currents. These suggestionists hold that the subject acts upon the command and suggestion and does what he is told, and that that is all there is to it. The suggestible condition to them means a condition in which the subject yields up his whole attention to the operator, and thus becomes suggestible, the degrees varying with the temperament, etc., of the subject. While the suggestionists believe that suggestion is a whole explanation and cause, I hold that it is but one of the methods of producing the effects, and that back of suggestion is the induction of the mental state by the suggester, as I have stated in my work on mental magic, and as I shall bring out in the present manual. Personal magnetism. Along with the new theories of suggestion without sleep, there has arisen a great interest in personal magnetism during the past few years. There has been much written on the subject, some good and some ridiculous, and some between the two extremes. The laws of the subject are being studied by the thinking public. There has been a great revival in the interest in occultism, which, together with the various phases of mental science, theosophy, New Thought, and kindred subjects, has attracted the attention of a large portion of the public to the general subject of mental magic, and to the special subject of mental fascination in particular. And this manual is written in response to the present demand for definite information on the subject. I feel sure that I will be able to show you that the law of mentative energy, in its operation along the line of mentative currents, as stated in my book on mental magic, will account for all the phenomena mentioned above in the history of the general subject, as well as many other forms. I believe that I can bring it all under the definition of the action of a mental force that powerfully influences the imagination, desire, or will of another, which is my definition of mental fascination. End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of Mental Fascination. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. Mental Fascination by William Walker Atkinson. Chapter 4. The Reconciliation. In my last chapter I have shown you the opposing theories of the various schools which have investigated and experimented along the lines of mental fascination under some of its many names. All of these schools obtained results, notwithstanding their varying and diametrically opposite theories — the same kinds of results, remember. And more than this, they all obtained these results in very much the same way, when we come to examine the essence of the procedure, after discarding the forms added to fit in with the particular theories of the practitioner. A new synthesis. I believe that all the opposing theories of the schools may be reconciled by a new synthesis. That of mentative energy, with its incidental phenomenon of mentative induction, as set forth in my Mental Magic, and further expounded in this little manual of which this chapter is a part. I believe that theories so far divergent as Mesmer's universal magnetic fluid, Abi Faria's sleep, Braid's hypnotism, Bovie Dodd's electrobiology, Leiboldt's suggestion, Bernheim's suggestion, the later suggestion without sleep, Bremann's fascination, and the various other theories advanced since the time of Mesmer, can be reconciled and harmonized by a careful application of the theory of Mentative Induction as advanced in my work on Mental Magic. And I believe that all the phenomena obtained by any and all of the above schools, as well as the phenomena of the ancient Fascinators, and the phenomena known as Personal Magnetism, Charming, Personal Influence, Magnetic Personality, etc., etc., of ancient and modern times, may be accounted for by the same theory. And so this chapter shall be devoted to the reconciliation of the various old theories with this basic principle of Mentative Induction. Mesmer explained. Let us first examine the real facts underlying Mesmer's theory of the universal magnetic fluid. Mesmer taught that there existed a peculiar subtle fluid, magnetic in its nature, which was diffused throughout all space, which permeated everything, and which was capable of receiving and communicating all sorts of motions and impressions. He taught that this fluid flowed freely from one body to another, acted at a distance, and could be reflected by a mirror, etc. He did not explain what this fluid was, except that it produced magnetic effects, and must therefore be magnetic in its nature. He proved that he could produce effects, and he gave out a theory to fit in with the facts, and that was within the comprehension of the people of his time. Now let us apply the idea of universal Mentative Energy, with its incidental phenomenon of Mentative Induction, to Mesmer's theory, and see how easily the reconciliation is effected. The Mentative Energy, like Mesmer's fluid, is universal, is diffused through all space, permeates everything. Like the fluid, it apparently passes from body to body and communicates impressions, etc. But now we know that the energy is transmitted in waves or vibrations which reproduce the original feeling by Mentative Induction in the second person. There is no necessity for the flowing fluid any more than there is for an electric fluid flowing over wires or through the air. The fluid idea has been superseded by the wave idea in both physics and metaphysics. The nature of the magnetic fluid. We may readily see that this magnetic fluid theory of Mesmer may be explained by the theory of Mentative Energy and Mentative Induction. There is no magnetic fluid. The energy is mental in nature and operation, and the phenomena arising therefrom is mentative also. Mesmer sought for his answer in physics, but we find it in metaphysics. The force is not physical, it is mental. All the phenomena obtained by Mesmer and his followers may be accounted for by the theory of Mentative Energy and Mentative Induction. The mental states of the Mesmerist may be communicated to his subject by waves of Mentative Energy, and a corresponding feeling or mental state is induced by Mentative Induction. As we shall see as we proceed, the sleep of the Mesmerist and hypnotist is merely an induction condition arising from the desire in the mind of the operator, accompanied by the suggestion on his part. Fabrea explained. The theory of Abbe Faria, that the sleep condition was not the result of any outside force, but arose from within the patient himself, is also reconciled by the theory of Mentative Energy and Induction. Of course the sleep arises from within the patient himself, but it is induced by the waves of Mentative Energy of the operator, accompanied by his active suggestions. Braid reconciled. Braid's theory is also reconciled. He held that the phenomenon was of a physical nature, rather than a mental, and that it was a reflex physical action arising from fixing the eyes, rigidity of the muscles, etc. His hypnotic sleep was undoubtedly heightened by his practice of tiring the eyes and muscles, on the same principle that one is tired mentally by unusual exertion of the eyes, as in the case of visiting an art gallery, museum, strange city, etc. And that the power of resistance is thereby weakened, and one is far more likely to then accept suggestions of mentative waves. How many of us have felt mentally done out after visiting a museum, or after witnessing a long parade, or after sitting through a modern circus performance, with its 3 rings going at one time? And who does not remember how many foolish things he had done at times when he was too tuckered out to object to the suggestions and influences of those around him? A danger signal. Many a girl has gone to her ruin by the subtle suggestions and influence of some male scoundrel, directed toward her after an evening of the show or circus, or after a day of sightseeing in a strange city. I tell you, friends, that in such cases the will becomes tired by overuse arising from unaccustomed tasks, and it becomes woozy and incapable of resisting the attacks upon it. As I have told you in my larger work, beware of all suggestions, etc., when in a tired state. Make a habit of saying "No" to attempts to make you commit yourself at such times. Wait until you feel fresh and strong, and the will is able to attend its business for you. Many a man has said yes to his sorrow, to propositions advanced to him when he was tired by the day's work, and his will was weak and unable to resist. I cannot say this to you too often, and have therefore dragged it in again at this place. There is a great psychological principle involved in this point, and you will do well to fasten it in your memory. Braid's theory may be reconciled to the idea of Mentative Energy and Induction, when we see that his eye fixation and muscular rigidity is merely the means of producing a suggestible condition, that is to say, a condition in which suggestions are more readily accepted, and mentative currents are more readily received, in both cases the tired will allowing the outside influence to enter. Suggestion explained. The theories of Suggestion are not contrary to those of Mentative Energy and Induction, when properly understood. The facts of the Suggestionists are undoubted, but they make the mistake of ignoring the mental states of the Suggestionist. They think that their effects are produced by Suggestion alone, and forget the mental state behind the Suggestion, which is the real motive force. If their theories be true, why is it that two men using the same words of suggestion upon the same subject produce varying degrees of effect? It is because the mental states or dynamic mentation of the two men vary in quality and degree. The Suggestionist thinks that he is merely directing his suggestion by words, etc., toward the subject, but all the time he is pouring out a current of Mentative Energy which rapidly induces the desired mental state in the subject. The best Suggestionists are those who have acquired the Suggestive Manner, which is developed by the exercise of authoritative utterances and commands, the physical appearance, manner, and tones arising from a reflection of the mental state within. I have seen this in the case of one of America's most celebrated Suggestionists, a prominent physician and scientist with whom I was associated in magazine and other work in the years 1900 and '01. I have seen the doctor giving the most powerful suggestions at one of his classes or clinics; so powerful were the emanations of Mentative Energy, or currents of the same, that the members of the class could distinctly feel the same, and at times could almost see them. And yet the doctor, who was wedded to his particular theories of Suggestion, pure and simple, after such a wonderful manifestation, would calmly inform his class that it was nothing but Suggestion, nothing more to it. And he believed it, but hundreds who attended his classes went away more firmly convinced than ever that there was something more to it, and that there was a cause behind his suggestions. The theory of Suggestion is all right, but what lies back of Suggestion? What gives the suggestion its force? Of what inner and invisible thing is the suggestion the visible and outward sign? Mentative Energy. Inharmony harmonized. And my theory of Mentative Energy and Induction may be reconciled with the theories of the later Suggestionists, including those who still adhere to the sleep delusion, as well as those who have advanced beyond it. And it explains all the phenomena of the ancients, with the religious and mystic rites. The phenomena of charming, fascination, personal magnetism, personal influence, etc., is all embraced under the theory advanced in this work, and my larger work which preceded it. As we proceed with this work, we shall see the Mentative Energy and Mentative Induction in actual active operation in these various phases of phenomena, but I trust that this chapter will have shown you that there is one principle underlying all of the various theories and phenomena, and that the facts of Mentative Energy, and the operation of the same in its phenomenal incident of Mentative Induction, are sufficient to include and cover all of the varying manifestations of the force observable under the disguises of the conflicting theories of the various schools and cults. There is but one underlying cause, and that is Mentative Energy. There is but one underlying law of the operation of this force in the direction of affecting other minds, and that law is Mentative Induction, either direct, i.e., by Mentative currents, or indirect, i.e., by Suggestion, or, as is generally the case, by both combined. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Mental Fascination. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. Mental Fascination by William Walker Atkinson. Chapter 5. The Rationale of Fascination. In this chapter I shall proceed to lay before you the rationale of Fascination, that is, an exposition of the principles of its operation. While the phenomena of Fascination extends over a very wide area or field, there is still to be found a certain unity of principle of operation underlying all of the forms and phases. From this point of view we may speak of the Science of Fascination, as well as of the Philosophy of Fascination. The Fundamental Principle. The fundamental principle of the operation of the mental phenomena known as Fascination is found in the theory of Mentative Induction, as stated in my work on Mental Magic, and which is briefly stated in the first chapter of the present book. This theory, you will remember, holds that each individual mind is a center of Mentative Energy, and that the Mentative Energy of an individual mind may be, and is, transmitted from one person to another by means of Mentative Waves or Currents. That these Mentative Waves or Currents tend to induce in the minds of other persons the emotions or feelings existing in the mental states of the person sending out the waves or currents. In this connection we must also remember that there are two mental poles, known as the Motive and Emotive poles respectively. The Motive pole manifesting as Will Power, and the Emotive pole manifesting as Desire Force. Desire Force acts in the direction of drawing, pulling, attracting, luring, coaxing, charming, etc., while Will Power acts in the direction of compelling, forcing, driving, impelling, commanding, demanding, etc. Desire Force always draws its object towards itself, while Will Power always overpowers and compels its object, generally in the sense of driving it into action. Mentative Induction. This Mentative Induction acts along similar lines to the induction of electricity and magnetism, that is, it sets up similar states in the object affected. And the resemblance is even still further marked when we consider that the phenomena of electricity closely resemble the action of the Will, inasmuch as both tend to drive outward in the form of an impelling force, and that the phenomena of magnetism resemble the action of Desire, inasmuch as both tend to draw inward in the form of an attracting energy. An interesting question. In this connection, however, I would direct the attention of the student to one fact concerning the effect of induced states, which some have failed to grasp in my teachings in my work on Mental Magic. The matter may be stated by the inquiry of a student of the last mentioned work, who inquires as follows: "Please inform me how it is that an induced mental state reproduces the original mental state of the Mentator in the following case. A man desires to have another perform a certain act, and sends a Mentative Current which acts by induction on the mind of the second person, setting up an induced mental state therein. The second person then performs the act desired by the first person. Now, if the induced mental state was the same as the original one, would not the second party simply also desire that the first party should do the act, just as the first party desired that the second should do it? But it does not work so, for the second party does not so desire, but instead merely desires to do just what the first party desired him to do. That is, he feels within himself a desire to do that which the first party desires shall be done. It seems to me that the induced state is really the opposite of the original state. Please set me straight on this." The answer: I am very glad to have the opportunity to set straight my students on this point. A careful examination will show that both states are similar. For instance, A desires that B shall do a certain thing, and induces a similar state in B. The induced state produces in B a like desire that the things shall be done as he proceeds to do it. No opposite action here, is there? The essence of the desire in both cases is the same, namely, that the thing shall be done. The expression of the feeling of the two persons in the case as 1. I desire that you shall do, and 2. I desire to do, respectively, are merely the personal forms of expression, and not the essence of the desire or feeling. The desire or feeling in its real essence is, I desire this thing done. And both hold the same desire, A holding the original desire or feeling, and B the induced desire or feeling. Think this over a little until you see the point. Induced Will acts in the same way as the above mentioned instance of the action of the induced desire. Of course, in all cases of the action of desire the Will is also called into operation. In the above cited case it works as follows: A feels the desire to have the thing done, and so his Will is called into operation to concentrate the Mentative Currents, and to project them to a focused point on the mind of B. Then B, feeling the induced desire that the thing shall be done, awakens his Will and does the thing. Do you see this also? You had better fix this process firmly in your minds, for it is the key to the operation of the principle of Fascination and other Mentative phenomenon. Making another feel like doing. Now to get back to the first principle, which is that one person may make a second person feel like doing a thing that the first person wishes to have done. That is the thing in a nutshell. And in the degree that the second person so feels like doing the thing, so will be the degree of desire and will induced in him, and consequently so will be the likelihood of his actually doing it. You see, the matter of feeling like is at the bottom of it all. And this being so, it is readily seen that if one is able to induce a state of feeling like in another, he has the secret of the control of the other person's actions. Now this is the basis of Mental Fascination. Now let us see how this principle works out in a case of Mesmerism or Hypnotism, so called, which after all is but a phase of Mental Fascination, governed by the above mentioned principle. I prefer the term Mesmerism for several reasons, among them being the fact that it is a recognition of Mesmer, its discoverer or rediscoverer, and also the fact that Hypnotism means sleep, while Mesmerism covers the whole phenomena in both its waking or sleep conditions. A case of Mesmerism. Well, let us suppose a case of Mesmerism. The mesmerist, whom I will call the operator, faces the subject. The operator assumes a positive state of mind, his will power being active and concentrated, practice having improved him along these lines. The subject naturally assumes a negative mental state, opening his emotive mental pole to the influence of the mind or will of the operator, and allowing his motive mental pole to remain quiescent or relaxed. That is to say, he opens his desire mind to the influence of the operator, and lets his will remain inactive and relaxed. The operator desires and wills that the subject be influenced, and the subject agrees, consciously or unconsciously, to be so influenced. One wills, and the other is willing, which latter paradoxical expression means that he is not willing. The operator naturally asserts his positivity, while the subject assumes a decided state of negativity. One asserts a supremacy of will, and the other submits. I would call your attention to the fact that there is no physical compulsion or influence in the matter; it is all a matter of mentation. And both parties fully recognize the reality of the phenomenon. The silent conflict. The above relative mental state of the two persons is apparent in a greater or lesser degree whenever two persons meet. One is always stronger mentatively than the other, and a silent conflict ensues from which one or the other emerges a victor, and the result is recognized and acquiesced in by both victor and vanquished. Ordinarily, however, the distinction is not nearly so marked or great as in the case of a strong mesmerist and his negative subject, the latter having probably been trained in negativity by repeated trials and experiments in private and in public. For know you, that even as Positivity may be cultivated, developed, and strengthened by practice and actual performance, so, alas, may Negativity be encouraged, developed, and made habitual by a continued practice of giving in to the will of another, or others. It is all a matter of habit. Positive and Negative. It will be seen at once that given a subject and operator bearing the stated degrees of relative Positivity and Negativity, the subject will have a tendency to accept and obey the wishes and commands of the operator with a minimum degree of resistance. The operator will strongly wish the subject to feel in a certain way, and to act upon the feeling. To accomplish this result, he will concentrate his desire by his will, and then direct a combined and focused attack on the mind of the subject. He is likely to call Suggestion to his aid in the attack, for by so doing he is able to obtain an additional advantage, for a Suggestion, as I have stated in my work on Mental Magic, is a physical agent inducing mental states, or an outward and visible sign of an inward feeling or mental state, which tends to induce a similar feeling in the mind of accepting the Suggestion. The Suggestive Command. The operator gives the subject in the Suggestion by command, and in accordance with the phrase of Suggestion known as Suggestion through Obedience. See my work on Mental Magic. The subject obeys. It must not be forgotten, however, that the Suggestion is merely the outward symbol of the inward mental state of the operator, and becomes effective only by reason of this fact. The operator throws his intensified desire force and will power into the Suggestion, and receives an effect along the line of the threefold activity. With his will he produces a dual effect, i.e., 1. He captivates the desire of the subject, and induces in it the desired feeling-like state. 2. He takes captive the will of the subject, and subjugates it to his own. And at the same time, by his desire he also produces a dual effect, i.e., 1. He induces a similar desire in the mind of the subject by mentative waves or currents, and 2. He allures or seduces the will of the subject by the strength of his desire. The result of this combined attack causes the mind of the subject to act as follows, which adds a third dual effect to the operation, i.e., 1. The subject's desire, being induced as stated by the operator, acts to influence his own will, thus making the latter fall in with the induced desire. 2. The subject's will, controlled as stated by the operator, acts upon its own desire, thus making the latter fall in with the seduced will. It must be remembered that the three mental operations above mentioned are concurrent, that is, they act at the same time, and exercise joint action and control upon the mind of the subject. And neither the operator nor the subject are necessarily conscious of there being three dual actions under way. The operator simply desires and wills, with or without Suggestion, while the subject simply feels like, as before stated, and accepts the Suggestion if one is given, without recognizing the various mental operations going on to produce the feeling like. The detailed explanation may make the operation seem complicated, while in reality it appears to both the operator and subject as quite a simple matter indeed. The Day Dream State. The above process is the same whether the operator merely produces the simplest result upon the subject, or whether he secures the most remarkable and startling exhibitions of the control of one mind by another. The principle of operation is the same in all cases. With sleep or without sleep, it is the same. In fact, as we shall see, the very sleep condition is produced just as are the other effects, and its production merely tends to produce a day dream state in the subject, and thus makes him act in a day dream like manner, with appropriate illusions. Sleep phenomena are merely one of the side issues of mesmerism when the true principle is understood. Habit and repetition. Habit and repetition. In our consideration of the operation of mesmerism, we must not forget the part that habit and repetition play in the matter. For instance, the operator may be able to produce only the simplest effects at first trial, but at each subsequent trial, in which he gains more and more control over the subject, and a greater acquiescence and degree of obedience, he is able to obtain a still more marked effect. If you will read my remarks on the suggestion by repetition in my work on Mental Magic, page 120, you will realize the awful force of repetition in habit, as well as the power of repeated statement. This psychological fact is like the operation of the wedge. Admit the thin edge, and each additional blow drives it further in. This works along the lines of both good and evil. Remember, the wise use it to their own strengthening, while the foolish allow it to be their undoing. Beware of the thin edge of the wedge of undesirable habits of thought and action. A psychological law. The mesmerist understands well, often too well, the nature and results of the above mentioned psychological law. He has found out by experience that although it may be difficult to control a subject the first time, it will be easier the next, and so on and on until perfect control is obtained. And, knowing this, he bends his endeavors to inserting the very thinnest edge of the wedge, understanding that in this he has his hardest task before him. And alas, how many of us know that this same principle is in operation in everyday life, although seemingly having nothing to do with mesmerism? How many of us are able to regret the day of the entry of the thin edge of the wedge? Another point to be remembered is that the subject who is under a fair degree of control does not feel as if he were obeying the commands or wishes of the operator alone. That is, not in the main. It is true that he instinctively obeys the command of the suggestion, just as a horse quickens his gait when spoken to, or a soldier acts quickly in obedience to orders, etc., etc. But the motive for the action, or feeling, seems to come from within himself to a great degree. It has the force and effect of an instinctive action proceeding along subconscious lines. He seems to want to do the thing of his own accord. This is the dangerous feature. This, then, in a general way, is the rationale of Mental Fascination as shown in its phase of mesmerism, and its corresponding exhibitions along less pronounced lines. If you will acquaint yourselves with these principles of operation, you will have a grasp on the whole subject. In our next chapter we shall have a view of the mental states of operator and subject, which will throw additional light upon the subject before us. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Mental Fascination. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. Mental Fascination by William Walker Atkinson. Chapter 6. Impressionability. In the last chapter I laid before you an exposition of the principles of the operation of Mental Fascination, particularly in its phases of mesmerism. The student who has followed what I have said therein has seen that there must of necessity be a marked difference in the degree of impressionability or receptivity to mental induction, manifested by the operator and subject respectively, in order that the pronounced phenomena may be manifested. But this difference of degree of impressionability is manifested by all men and women. Between the one extreme point in the scale of impressionability to the other extreme there are many degrees, and each person has his or her own degree, subject, of course, to change by development. Magnetic Positivity. I would like to quote from my work on Mental Magic, illustrating this last mentioned point. I have said therein, I do not mean that the degree of magnetic positivity is fixed permanently in either person, for the contrary is the case. One of the persons, who is really the stronger, usually, may be weaker at that particular moment, owing to his will being fatigued, or by reason of his having relaxed his will power, as often is the case. And in such case the defeated one may be the victor at the last encounter, or may even rally his energies a moment later, and thus turn the tables. One may have a strong will in moments of activity, and yet in moments of passivity he may relax it very much. And this is a still more important fact: one may so increase his will power that he will be able to completely dominate those who formerly overmastered and then overawed him. All of us know of instances of this kind in our own personal experience. The two extremes. At the extreme point of mental positivity are the wonderfully strong-willed men who are natural leaders and managers. At the extreme of negative mentative point are those people who are moved by every passing suggestion or mental current with which they may come in contact, those impressionable people who seem to live in the emotional plane of their being, and who are always open to outside influences, and are like weathercocks moved by every passing breeze. These people are really the reflection of the thoughts, desires, and wills of others, the last person who catches their attention being the right one to follow. You all know the type, don't you? I do not mean by this that only persons naturally weak-willed may be mesmerized. But I do say that when strong-willed people allow themselves to be mesmerized, they must relax their wills and become passive or negative to the operator, else there will be no result gained. A strong-willed man may voluntarily relax and become negative in order to be mesmerized. I have seen this done in many cases, although I have always urged against it, for I consider it inadvisable for one to surrender his will in this way, even for the purpose of scientific investigation. I am sure that I would not do so myself, and therefore I cannot approve of the practice on the part of others. The artistic temperament. Then again, I have known people of a highly developed artistic temperament, such as actors, poets, artists, writers, and others who possessed strong wills, to allow themselves to become very impressionable by reason of their active imaginations. That is to say, they would allow themselves to be so carried away with the idea of being impressed that they would throw themselves into the part of the mesmerized subject, and actually mesmerize themselves, although allowing the operator to take the credit. This last explanation will throw light on a phase of phenomena that apparently presents an exception to the rule, but which, when viewed in the light of the above explanation, may be seen to come strictly within the rule of positivity and negativity. A mesmerist's trick. Public performers of mesmerism, when they meet with an imaginative subject whose will is too strong to subdue, often begin to bend their efforts toward arousing the imagination of the person and thus causing him to become passive and in a subjective condition of acting out the part suggested by the operator. In such cases there is no conflict of wills whatever, but on the contrary the subject wills to act out the part and becomes the partner of the mesmerist instead of his opponent. The subject in such cases mesmerizes himself, and voluntarily allows himself to be led by the suggestions of the operator so long as the suggestions are not contrary to the subject's own interests. This actor instinct is very strong in some people, and this self-mesmerism is far more common than people imagine. It is seen on the stage, and among speakers and writers. Mesmeric subjects. Even many of the best mesmeric subjects who travel around with the professional mesmerists are of this last mentioned class to a certain degree. They are able to throw themselves into the parts and play them well, so long as they are not adversely affected thereby. They are far different beings from the weak-willed, flabby creatures that are so often seen following around after the professional mesmerists. The imaginative professional subject is alive to his own interests, and as a somewhat cynical friend of mine, who had made a close study of the subject, once said, even the most obedient subject of this class would utterly fail to act upon the suggestion of his powerful operator to effect that the subject consent to a reduction of his weekly wages paid by the operator, even though the deep stage of hypnotic sleep be produced. Don't surrender your will. But I consider that even this imaginative class of subjects are unwise in allowing themselves to be guided and governed by the suggestions and commands of any operator, for I believe that even such a habit is injurious to the will. The will is a precious thing and should not be prostituted in this way. I cannot urge this too strongly upon my students. I say to them, surrender your will into no one's keeping. Regard it as a woman should her virtue, and allow no one to take liberties with it. Who can exert fascination? The average person possessing self-confidence and force can, and does, exert mental fascination over others with whom he comes in contact, although it requires a developed will to become an expert in this line of mental work. Besides this, there is undoubtedly a certain knack and technique about the work, which is acquired by practice, although some seem to have it considerably developed naturally. There are geniuses in fascination as well as in art, and there are others who have acquired the mastery in both by careful practice and determination. The requisite for fascination. In considering the qualities that go to make up the person in whom mental fascination is likely to be strongly developed, I may mention the following. 1. Physical well-being. For there is a certain strength about a man or woman in strong, robust health that must be taken into consideration. It is true that some persons not physically well but unhealthy have exercised strong powers of fascination, but this was in spite of their lack of physical health and owing to a strong will which allowed them to master even this obstacle. But, all else being equal, there is a power about a strong, healthy, vigorous person that makes itself felt. 2. Belief in oneself, for without this no one manifests positivity. Believe in your own power and ability, and you impress others with the same belief. Confidence is contagious. Cultivate the "I can" and "I will." 3. Poise. For the calm, well poised, imperturbable man has an enormous advantage over one lacking these qualities. The man who meets any emergency without losing his head has something about him that makes him looked up to as a natural leader. He has one of the qualities of positivity. Cultivate the calm, masterful mood. 4. Fearlessness. For fear is the most negative emotion in the being of man. Fearlessness is a most positive quality, just as fear is the most negative. Cultivate the "I do," "I dare." 5. Concentration. For this one pointedness focuses the will power upon the object. Do one thing at a time, and do it with all the power there is in you. 6. Fixity of purpose. For you must learn to know what you want to do and then stick to it until it is done. Cultivate the bulldog quality. It is needed. To those who recognize the need of the above mentioned qualities but who lack them, I would recommend the careful study and determined application of the principles of mental architecture, as stated in my 7th lesson in my work on Mental Magic, in which the matter is gone into detail with exercises, etc. Nonsense exposed. There has been much nonsense written about who make good subjects, etc., in works upon mesmerism, hypnotism, etc., and many amusing rules for the determination of the degree of impressionability have been given by many writers. Some say that brunettes are the most impressionable, while others assert that blondes yield more readily, etc., etc., but the experienced investigator laughs at such distinctions. Some consider that women make the best subjects, while others assert that men really are more readily influenced. My own opinion is that the percentage is about the same in both sexes. Then again, one must remember that the degrees of impressionability are relative. For instance, A may be positive to B, while B may be positive to C, and so on to the end of the alphabet. And using the same illustration, M is negative to L, though positive to N. Do you see this? A lie nailed. Some writers have tried to make people believe that only strong-minded people may be mesmerized, and give as proof thereof the fact that idiots and insane people are almost immune from hypnotic and mesmeric influence. This is a favorite argument of the professional hypnotists, who use it in order to put at ease their subjects, or possible subjects, who might not wish to appear as weak-minded people. The truth is that the reason that the above classes are exempt is because, 1. The idiots have little or no power of attention, and are like mere machines, and consequently cannot be induced to pay attention long enough to be mesmerized; but all advanced students of mental influence know that idiots, as well as animals, may be influenced by mental vibrations, or mental waves, etc., by treatments. 2. Insane people are usually carried away with a fixed idea or delusion, and are, in fact, practically in a state akin to that produced by hypnotic or mesmeric process to a marked degree. Their minds are centered on the delusion and cannot be taken off of it. If the attraction could be removed, the patient would no longer be insane, and although the sleep condition cannot well be induced in insane patients, still the best authorities know that such people often yield to strong suggestions, and mental treatments to a certain degree, so that the rule does not always hold. Impressionable people. The class of people who yield most readily to the mesmeric influence, outside of the subclass of imaginative people mentioned a few pages further back, are those who have not manifested their will, determination, and self-reliance very much. People who have led a life in which implicit obedience or reliance upon others have been cultivated, these are the people who are the most impressionable. They have not used their wills, and are more readily ruled by the wills of others, or through their emotions. As I have said in my larger work, the degree of response to suggestion by command is to be observed in the highest degree among those who have always depended upon others for orders, or instruction, and have not had to use their own wits and resources in life. Unskilled laborers and the sons of rich men who have had someone to think for them often belong to this class. These people seem to want someone else to do their thinking for them, even in the smallest event of their lives, and are most impressionable along the proper lines. Then the degree of positivity rises as we consider the people who have had to do things for themselves, and who have not depended so much upon others. Positivity is the greatest among people who have had the ordering of others to do, or who have had to depend upon their own resources and their own wits in getting through life. The men of marked initiative have scarcely a trace of this form of suggestibility. Initiative, you know, is a term for doing things without being told, using one's own wits and resources and will. The above applies equally to the subject of impressionability, to mesmeric influence. And what does it all mean when it is boiled down? Just this, that the degree of impressionability depends upon the degree of the lack of will development. The word will is the keynote. And this in spite of all the talk, twaddle, and nonsense written and spoken by those who are interested in having the people appreciate the wonderful virtue of hypnotism. The mob spirit. The reason that mobs allow themselves to be influenced is because they surrender their individuality and individual will and allow it to become merged with the wills of others until a mob will is created, which represents the average of the crowd, the weaker wills diluting the strength of the whole. When this mess of mingled and weakened will is properly mixed, it remains in a dazed and excited condition until some individual springs to the front, some leader of men who has held on to his individual will and impresses his will upon the more negative will of the crowd, and the mob accepts his suggestions and follows like sheep or mesmerized subjects and does his bidding until some other leader catches its attention and interest. Emotionability. There is another phase of mentality that has its bearing upon the degree of impressionability. I refer to the quality known as emotionability. An emotional person is one who more readily throws off the influence of his own will and reason and gives himself up to the play of the emotional side of his nature. Such a person is more impressionable than one who is not so emotional, but whose will is really no stronger. The reason is that by his mental habits he has accustomed himself to open up his emotive pole of mentality to outside influences, and allowing his motive pole to remain inactive. He allows his feelings to rule him instead of ruling his feelings. He allows his emotional nature to usurp the throne of his will, the latter being relegated to second place. And the consequence is that his emotive nature has become more open to unresisted outside influences and impressions, and responds more readily to the same. It has acquired the impressionable habit. Do you see? This last explanation will throw some light on the fact that certain races of people are far more impressionable than others. They are emotional, that's all. Who is an impressionable? In the following chapters I shall use the term impressionable as a noun, designating a person who is sufficiently impressionable to respond to the influence of a mesmerist or hypnotist to a greater or lesser degree. These impressionables are comparatively easily impressed by the mentative force and suggestions of the experimenter along these lines. Please remember the sense in which I shall use the term. Later on I shall use the term hyper-impressionable as a noun, indicating a person excessively or abnormally impressible by mesmeric influence. The latter class will be further described in the proper place in the book. Let me give you a fanciful illustration of the subject of impressionability. It will form the subject of our next chapter, which will be entitled The Fable of the Mentative Couple. It will explain not only the matter of response to the mesmeric influence, but will also throw light on the exercise of personal mental influence that is going on around us in everyday life, all the time, everywhere. You will have a much clearer idea of the matter after reading this fable, and you will also be much more on your guard because of the lesson taught therein. Do not fail to read it carefully, and seek for the secret contained within its lines. End of Chapter 6.
Chapter 7 of Mental Fascination. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Mental Fascination by William Walker Atkinson. The Fable of the Mentative Couple. Once upon a time there lived in the land of Mentalvania, in a wonderful building called the Mentative Castle, a man and a woman called the Mentative Couple. They were happy, though married. They lived in harmony because they were useful to one another, and neither was complete without the presence of the other, and neither did his or her best work unless the other was present and assisting. Well now, the man was called Volos, which is the same as the English name Will, and the woman was called Emotione, which in the language of that country meant something like the combination of emotion, desire, and imagination. Now the chronicles inform us that these two people had natures entirely different from each other, as has been said. We are told that Volos was of a stern, inflexible, strong, positive nature, apt to stick to a thing once begun, full of the will to live and vitality, full of determination and spirit, with a strong dash of the let me alone and get out of my way in his make-up, with a taste for meeting difficulties and overcoming obstacles, with a goodly degree of habit of reaching out and taking hold of what Emotione wanted and needed, and a powerful lot of self-respect and self-reliance in him. He was apt to be firm, although his firmness was not the stubbornness of the mule, and his general keynote was strength. He was a good warrior and defender of his castle. But Emotione was of an entirely different type, temperament, and character. She was most impressionable, imaginative, emotional, credulous, fanciful, full of desire, curious, sympathetic, and easily persuaded. While Volos was all willing and thinking, Emotione was all feeling. Volos was a strong character, but lacked certain qualities that make for success. But these qualities Emotione possessed, and she supplied the deficiency in Volos. Volos had to figure out everything, while Emotione had intuition, and jumped at a conclusion in a way remarkable to Volos, who couldn't understand the process at all. When he would ask Emotione for an explanation, she would say lightly, "Oh, just because," which answer would often provoke profane and irreverent discourse on the part of Volos. But, nevertheless, he learned to respect these becauses of Emotione, and found that they helped him in his business. Emotione would dream out things and see things a long way ahead, and then Volos would proceed to put these plans into operation. Volos couldn't see very far ahead of his nose, while Emotione could see miles beyond and years ahead. And besides this faculty of mental imagery that came in so useful in Volos' business, Emotione also possessed a burning and ardent desire for things, which she managed to communicate to Volos, thereby causing him to get out and do things that otherwise he would never have dreamed of doing. Emotione was like fire, and Volos like water. The water would hold the fire in check, but at the same time the fire would heat up the water, and the result would be the steam of action. And so you see, these two, this mentative couple, formed a fine co-partnership and prospered mightily. But alas! the tempter entered Eden, and the attractive stranger meandered in the direction of the mentative castle, and when he reached there, trouble occurred. And this is what happened. One day Volos was absent from the castle, being engaged in some arduous enterprise, and consequently the castle was unguarded. Volos had provided against this by instructing Emotione that she was to keep the castle gate closed tight when he was away from home, and never to gaze without in his absence, for there was some mysterious danger lurking without when he was away. Emotione had faithfully followed the directions of her liege lord, although her womanly curiosity was piqued thereat. Many the time she had heard the strange knockings at the castle gate, but she heeded them not, and even refrained from looking out of the little peephole in the gate, though this last was much against her inclination, for she could see no harm in just looking. But to return to our tale, this particular day, when Volos was absent from home, her curiosity was too much for Emotione when she heard the strange knocking at the gate, and, breaking her rule, she ventured to peep without. Looking down, she saw a most attractive stranger, with a fascinating smile on his lips. He looked almost as strong as Volos, but he seemed to have a dash of the woman in him. Besides, he had the strength, but also the charm that Emotione recognized as being part of her own nature. "Ah," sighed Emotione, "here is a man who can understand me." The fascinating stranger smiled sweetly, and looking her in the eyes, masterfully asked to be admitted. "No, no," replied Emotione, "I cannot let you in, for Volos told me not to." "Ah, fair lady," said the stranger softly, "Volos means all right, but he is rather old fogyish and behind the times. He does not understand as do you and I. Pray, let me in." And, like Mother Eve, Emotione took the bait. Well, to make a long story short, When Volos came home, he found that Emotione had subscribed to a set of the Revue Moderne Art, a beautiful work issued by the Deluxe Brothers of Fifth Avenue, to be issued in 824 weekly parts, at the nominal price of $5 a part, 739 parts of which were already out, and would be delivered shortly. She had also given a number of side orders for manifold wares, which had dazzled her untrained and unguarded fancy. Volos cried to the gods of his land, but it was too late. The contracts had been signed. But that was but the beginning. Volos did not understand just what was the matter, and contented himself with scolding Emotione, whereat she wept bitterly. But the poison went on with its deadly work, and when Volos again was absent from home, the habit reasserted itself, and when the fascinating stranger again called at the castle, he was admitted. And when Volos returned, he found the castle furnished from dungeon to watch tower with costly rugs and furniture, and various other articles bought from Morgenstern's Popular Installment House, at 1,000 down and $100 per week. He also found that the castle had been lightning rodded from ground to turret on each wing, tower, and annex, and that notes containing a law-proof, judgment-confessed clause had been given in exchange therefor. And then Volos sware by the beard of Mars, the war god, that he would have no more of this. He would remain at home thereafter, and he did. But the subtle stranger was onto the game, in all of its details, and this is how he played it on Volos, even though the latter remained at home. A few days later, after Volos had determined to remain at home, there came a band of mountebanks, singing, dancing, and performing juggling tricks. Volos sat on the great stone beside the open castle gate, and his attention was attracted by the sounds and sights. Faster the dancers whirled, louder beat the drums, sweeter grew the singing, more bewildering grew the feats of jugglery, until poor Volos forgot all about the open castle gate, so rapt was he at the strange sights, sounds, dances, and feats of jugglery. Then one of the mountebank gang, who was really the attractive stranger disguised in motley array, slipped unseen past Volos, and in a moment was engaged in eager conversation with the impressionable Emotione. Volos watched the crowd until it moved away, and then entering the castle and closing the gate behind him, he was confronted by Emotione in tears, for she dreaded the coming storm. "Alack-a-day! Woe's me!" she cried. "I am again in trouble, O Volos, my liege lord! I have just ordered from the fascinating stranger who slipped past you at the gate, a baby grand, self-playing, automatic, liquid air valved radium carburetor harpsichord, upon which I may play for you all classes of music, ranging from Wagner's Götterdämmerung to the popular ragtime air entitled Kiss You, Babe, Goodbye, with feeling, depth of expression, and soulful understanding, according to the words of the fascinating stranger who took my order." "Godzooks!" ejaculated Volos. "Fain would I cry aloud the name of that production of Wagner's just mentioned by thee. And by my halidom, e'en shalt thou soon be singing to me the words of that ragtime melody just quoted by thy false red lips. Zounds! Of a truth I have been stung again by that fascinating stranger. I must gaze no more upon these fleeting scenes of merriment and amazement, lest I be again decorated with the ass's ears. Aha! Volos is himself again, and the next time the fascinating stranger appears upon the scene, he shall be smitten hip and thigh with my trusty battle-axe, and my snickersee shall pierce his foul carcass." But alas! Even once more was poor Volos deceived and trifled with. Once more was poor Emotione fascinated by the stranger, and it came about in this way. On the day of his last undoing, Volos sat on the open step in front of the narrowly opened castle door. "No man shall pass me now," cried he. But fate willed otherwise, for as he sat there approached many people who took seat upon the steps before the gate, and engaged Volos in long, heated, and wearisome discourses regarding the outlook for the crops, the presidential campaign, the Japanese question, race suicide, the new theology, how old was Anne, the problem of the final outcome of the collision between the irresistible force and the immovable body, the canals on Mars, what Roosevelt will do when his term expires, and many other weighty, interesting, and fascinating topics of general interest.